The air in the tiny Tuscan restaurant was thick with the scent of garlic and resentment, and both were coming from the woman at table 7. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and her net worth was valued at slightly over $1.2 billion. But in that moment, all the money in the world couldn't buy her a simple glass of sparkling water with a slice of lime, not lemon. Because in the remote Italian village of Montefiore, nobody understood English. And as her frustration boiled over into a fury that silenced the room, the billionaire was about to learn a devastating lesson from the one person she dismissed the most, the quiet waitress clearing plates in the corner. Eleanor Vance didn't do quaint. She conquered. She acquired. She dominated. Her life was a meticulously curated series of 5-star suites, private jets and boardrooms that smelled of expensive leather and fear. Her company, Vance Innovations, had revolutionized data storage with an algorithm so ruthless in its efficiency, it had bankrupted 3 of its competitors in a single quarter. She was a titan, a shark, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and terror in Silicon Valley. So what was she doing in Montefiore, a village so small it seemed to cling to its Tuscan hillside out of sheer stubbornness? Her therapist, Dr. Albright, had called it a mandatory disconnection. After a particularly brutal hostile takeover, even Eleanor had to admit she was fraying at the edges. The prescription 1 month, no phone, no laptop in a place where Vance Innovations was just a meaningless jumble of foreign words. She had lasted 6 days, the restaurant Il Nido del Corvo. The crow's nest was supposed to be the jewel of the village. It was everything she loathed. The stone walls were uneven, the wooden chairs scraped against the terracotta floor, and the air was filled with the boisterous chatter of families who had likely lived in the same square mile for generations. It was authentic, which to Eleanor was just another word for inefficient and inconvenient. She sat alone at table 7, a small table shoved near a window overlooking a valley of cypress trees. She had been trying for 10 minutes to communicate her order. It was not a complicated order in her opinion. It was precise. Acqua frizzante, she said, her voice sharp and clipped, holding up one finger. With lime. Lime. Not lemon. Lime. She made a small circular gesture with her fingers and then pointed to the green color of a nearby plant. The owner, a portly man named Marco, with a magnificent mustache and sweat beading on his brow, simply smiled, nodded enthusiastically, and scurried away. He returned moments later with a bottle of sparkling water and a small plate bearing 3 thick, fragrant slices of lemon. Eleanor stared at the plate. The bright yellow seemed to mock her. It was a small thing, a triviality, but to a woman whose entire empire was built on precision, it was a declaration of incompetence. It was a symbol of her powerlessness in this rustic prison. No, she said, her voice low. Marco's smile faltered. She pushed the plate of lemons back towards him. Lime. Green. Verde. She tapped her lacquered fingernail the color of dried blood on the table. Lime. Marco's face was a mask of confusion. He gestured to the lemons. Limone si limone. No, you idiot. She muttered under her breath, forgetting for a moment that tone was a universal language. The smile vanished completely from his face, replaced by a wounded look. He wrung his hands in his apron, looked around the packed restaurant for help, and then shrugged helplessly, backing away from the table as if she were a venomous snake. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She scanned the menu again, a single sheet of creamy, grease-stained paper. It was all in Italian. She wanted the sea bass, but she needed it grilled, not pan-fried. No butter, only a whisper of extra virgin olive oil. The vegetables on the side, asparagus, specifically steamed with no salt. Her dietary needs were as strict as her business requirements. She saw a young waiter passing by a boy of no more than 19 with a nervous energy about him. She flagged him down, her gesture imperious. "You, do you speak English?" The boy, whose name was Paolo, froze. He looked at her with wide, terrified eyes and shook his head, stammering, No inglese." Eleanor let out a sigh that was pure theatre, a gust of wind meant to signal her monumental suffering. Of course not. Why would anyone here bother to learn the global language of business and culture? She was losing her composure. The carefully constructed steel wall of her corporate persona was cracking under the assault of rustic charm. The other diners were beginning to notice. A family at a nearby table hushed their children, their dark eyes glancing at the furious American woman. She could feel their judgment, their resentment. They were locals. She was the intruder, and she hated it. She hated the feeling of being an outsider, of not being in control. It was in this rising tide of fury that she noticed the girl. She was in the corner, quietly clearing a table, her movements economical and graceful. She hadn't approached Eleanor, hadn't even looked in her direction. She wore the same simple black apron as the others, her dark hair pulled back in a simple no-nonsense bun. There was nothing remarkable about her. She was just another piece of the frustrating, incomprehensible scenery. Eleanor was about to call Marco back, to raise her voice, to make a scene so large and unpleasant that they would have no choice but to find someone somewhere in this God-forsaken village who could understand a simple request. Her hand was raised, her mouth open, to unleash the storm, when the girl from the corner finished wiping her table, placed the rag in her apron pocket, and began to walk towards her. The girl approached table 7 without haste. She didn't look intimidated or flustered, which in itself was irritating to Eleanor. Everyone in Eleanor's world was at least a little intimidated by her. It was part of her brand. As the girl drew closer, Eleanor took in her appearance with a dismissive, analytical eye. She was young, perhaps late 20s. Her face was pale and unadorned with makeup, dominated by large, intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold a quiet, watchful stillness. She wasn't beautiful in the polished, sculpted way of the women Eleanor knew, but there was a classical bone structure to her face that spoke of an old, deep-seated ancestry. She was, in Eleanor's estimation, utterly and completely unremarkable. A local girl born here, destined to die here, her greatest ambition likely to marry the baker's son. "Is there a problem, Signora?" Marco asked, reappearing at Eleanor's side, wringing his hands. He spoke in rapid, worried Italian, gesturing from Eleanor's thunderous face to the offending plate of lemons. Eleanor ignored him. Her gaze was fixed on the approaching waitress. This was it. This was her last attempt at civility, before the dam of her patience broke entirely. She would speak slowly. She would use small words. "I," she began, pointing a finger at her own chest. "Want to order dinner." She enunciated each syllable, as if speaking to a child or a simpleton. "Fish. Pesce." She made a swimming motion with her hand. "Grilled. Grigliato." She made a sizzling sound. "No. Butter. No. Salt." The girl stopped beside the table. She looked at the swimming hand, the sizzling sound, the furious billionaire, and then at Marco's panicked face. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her dark eyes. Marco launched into another torrent of Italian, explaining the situation to the waitress. He pointed at Eleanor, then at the lemons, then threw his hands up in a gesture of universal despair. The whole restaurant was watching now. The laughter had died down. The clinking of cutlery had ceased. There was only the sound of Eleanor's strained breathing and Marco's frantic whispers. This was precisely the kind of spectacle she abhorred, yet had created. She felt a hot flush of shame, immediately smothered by a wave of self-righteous anger. It was their fault, their incompetence, their backwardness. "This is absolutely unbelievable," Eleanor said, her voice rising, no longer caring who heard or understood. Or, "I am a guest in this country. I am trying to spend money in this establishment, and I am being treated with utter contempt. Is it so much to ask for a simple accommodation, a single employee who speaks the most common language on the planet?" She stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "I run a multinational corporation. I manage 20,000 employees across 9 countries. I can broker a deal worth $500 million over a breakfast meeting, but I cannot get a piece of grilled fish in this pathetic excuse for a restaurant." Her voice was trembling with rage now. "Forget it. Just forget it. I've lost my appetite. The sheer, unadulterated incompetence has curdled my stomach. Get me the bill for the water, and you can keep your damn lemons." She threw her napkin down on the table. It landed next to the plate of lemons with a soft, unsatisfying thud. Marco flinched as if she'd struck him. Paolo, the young waiter, looked like he was about to burst into tears. The family at the next table pulled their children closer. Eleanor felt a savage, ugly satisfaction at the chaos she had caused. Let them stare. Let them whisper. They would remember the angry American lady. She reached for her purse, a $25,000 Hermes Birkin that looked absurdly out of place among the checkered tablecloths. She would throw a €100 note on the table and storm out, leaving them to marvel at her wealth and her fury. It was a petty, hollow victory, but it was the only one available to her. It was then, in the dead, ringing silence that followed her tirade, that the quiet waitress finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a razor. It was calm, clear, and perfectly flawlessly unaccented. "The sea bass is excellent tonight, madam," she said, her English more refined than Eleanor's own. "I would recommend having it grilled with a touch of Sicilian olive oil and a sprinkling of sea salt. The steamed asparagus is also very fresh. And of course we have limes. We keep them behind the bar for the gin." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eleanor froze her hand, hovering over her purse. Every head in the restaurant swiveled to face the waitress. Marco's jaw hung open. Paolo's eyes were wide as saucers. Eleanor slowly lowered her hand and turned her head, her mind struggling to process the sound. It was like hearing a dog recite Shakespeare. The words were English, yes, but it was more than that. The accent was crisp, educated, with the faint, clipped musicality of someone who had spent a great deal of time at a top British university. It was the English of academia, of old money, of a world far removed from this dusty Tuscan village. She stared at the waitress, the simple apron, the plain face, the dark, knowing eyes, and for the first time in a very, very long time, Eleanor Vance was utterly, completely speechless. The silence that followed the waitress's words was heavier and more profound than the one that had followed Eleanor's outburst. It was a silence born of pure shock. Eleanor stood half-risen from her chair, her power pose deflating like a punctured balloon. She felt a strange heat creep up her neck. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. The image of the humble waitress and the sound of that impeccably articulated English simply didn't compute. The waitress, for her part, seemed unaffected by the sensation she had caused. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Marco, who was still gaping at her as if she'd sprouted wings. He closed his mouth with a snap and retreated, mumbling to himself in stunned Italian. "Please sit," the waitress said, her voice retaining its quiet authority. She gestured to Eleanor's chair. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a gentle command. Mechanically, Eleanor sat down. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of stock prices, legal strategies, and market projections, was suddenly blank. She watched as the waitress effortlessly cleared the small plate of lemons, replacing it moments later with an identical plate bearing 2 perfectly cut wedges of deep green lime. She then poured the sparkling water into Eleanor's glass, the bubbles fizzing softly. "My name is Isabella," she said, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. There was no apology in her gaze, but no triumph either. There was only a calm, professional neutrality that was more disarming than any apology could have been. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. Marco, the owner, is a wonderful man, but his English is limited to hello and thank you." Eleanor found her voice, though it came out as a croak. You speak English." It was a statement of the obvious, a testament to her disorientation. "Yes," Isabella replied simply. She stood by the table, a small notepad and a pen appearing in her hand, as if from nowhere. "Now about your order. The grilled sea bass, as I mentioned, with steamed asparagus, no salt, and a light dressing of olive oil." "Is that correct?" She had remembered every single one of Eleanor's persnickety demands. Eleanor, who prided herself on her memory for contractual clauses and financial data, was taken aback. "Yes," she said, her voice regaining some of its usual steel, though it felt brittle. "That's correct." "An excellent choice," Isabella said, making a neat, precise note on her pad. "And to drink perhaps a glass of our local vernaccia. It's quite dry and pairs beautifully with the base." The suggestion was so perfectly normal, so expertly delivered, that it almost reset the scene. But Eleanor couldn't let it go. Her mind was racing, trying to categorize this woman, to put her in a box. The accent, the vocabulary, it was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of her carefully ordered world. People like this, waitresses in tiny rural villages, didn't speak like that. "Where did you learn to speak English like that?" Eleanor asked the question, coming out more like an accusation. Isabella didn't look up from her notepad. Here and there she said evasively. She finished her note and tucked the pen behind her ear. "Your meal will be about 15 minutes. Can I bring you some bread and olives while you wait?" The dismissal, polite as it was unmistakable. She was being handled. Eleanor Vance, the woman who handled everyone, was being managed by a waitress. The thought was both infuriating and, to a small, disquieted part of her, intriguing. "Yes." "Fine," Eleanor clipped. Isabella gave a slight bow of her head and turned to leave. As she walked toward the kitchen, the hushed whispers in the restaurant swelled behind her. She moved through them without a second glance, her back straight, her purpose clear. She handed the order slip to the chef through the service window, speaking to him in the same fluent, musical Italian she had heard from everyone else. She was a chameleon, moving between 2 worlds, with an ease that Eleanor found deeply unsettling. Left alone at her table, Eleanor took a sip of her water. The lime was perfect. She looked around the restaurant. Everyone was now studiously avoiding her gaze, but she could feel their curiosity. The dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. She was no longer the powerful, intimidating outsider. She was the woman who had made a fool of herself, screaming at a room full of people, only to be placated by a polyglot waitress. Who was this Isabella? The question burrowed into Eleanor's mind. It wasn't just idle curiosity. For a woman who built her empire on understanding systems and exploiting weaknesses, an anomaly like Isabella was a puzzle that demanded to be solved. She wasn't just a waitress. Of that, Eleanor was now absolutely certain. There was a story here, a history that did not align with her surroundings. And Eleanor Vance, having been thrown so thoroughly off balance, was determined to find out what it was. Her mandatory disconnection had just become a mission. The bread arrived on a small wooden board, still warm from the oven, accompanied by a bowl of glossy dark olives, glistening in golden oil. The simple offering was of a quality that would have cost a small fortune in one of the Michelin-starred restaurants Eleanor frequented. She ate a piece, the crust shattering the inside, soft and airy. It was delicious. The fact annoyed her. 15 minutes later, precisely as promised, Isabella returned with her meal. The sea bass was laid on a bed of perfectly steamed asparagus, its skin grilled to a delicate crisp. There was no ostentatious garnish, only a light sheen of olive oil and the clean scent of fresh fish. It was minimalist confident and exactly what she had demanded. Isabella placed the plate before her. "I hope everything is to your satisfaction," she said. It appears to be Eleanor conceded, her tone guarded. She was not going to be won over by a well-cooked piece of fish. Isabella was about to retreat when Eleanor spoke again, unable to contain her curiosity. "Your accent. It's not American. It's British. Oxbridge, I'd guess." Isabella paused, a flicker of surprise, the first genuine emotion Eleanor had seen from her crossed her face before being smoothed away. "You have a good ear." "I make it my business to have a good ear," Eleanor said. "It helps to know who you're dealing with." "So which was it, Oxford or Cambridge?" Isabella hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze drifting towards the window, towards the dark hills rolling away into the twilight. It was a look of such profound, ancient sorrow that it momentarily silenced Eleanor's interrogation. "Oxford," Isabella said softly, her eyes returning to Eleanor, but looking at something far beyond her. "I was at St. John's College." The name landed on the table with the weight of a granite slab. St. John's College, Oxford, one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most prestigious constituent colleges of the university. It wasn't just a place of education, it was a bastion of the global intellectual elite. Eleanor stared at her. "You were a student?" A small, sad smile touched Isabella's lips. "For a time. Then I was a professor." The confession hung in the air between them. A professor at Oxford. Eleanor felt that tilting sensation again, the ground shifting beneath her feet. Her entire initial assessment of this woman, local girl, simple, uneducated, was not just wrong, it was laughably embarrassingly wrong. She had berated an Oxford professor for not understanding her. A professor of what Eleanor asked her voice, now stripped of its condescension, replaced by a raw, hungry curiosity. "Comparative literature," Isabella replied. "My specialization was in 20th century narrative theory, the deconstruction of authorial voice." Eleanor, who held 2 degrees from Stanford, a bachelor's in economics, and an MBA, felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced since her own university days, intellectual inadequacy. She had read financial reports, legal documents, and market analysis. Isabella had read Joyce Proust and Derrida. In their original languages, no doubt. "So what in God's name are you doing here?" Eleanor asked the question. "Blunt clearing tables in a village in the middle of nowhere." The question was rude, invasive, and quintessentially Eleanor. But this time, it wasn't born of arrogance. It was born of a genuine, desperate need to understand. How does one go from the hallowed halls of Oxford to Il Nido del Corvo? Isabella's serene composure finally fractured. The sadness in her eyes deepened, becoming a vast, dark pool of grief. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small protective gesture. "Life is its own narrative, Miss Vance," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes the author loses the plot. Sometimes the story is revised in ways you could never anticipate." She looked around the small, bustling restaurant. "My family has owned this restaurant for 4 generations. It's my home. I came back because I needed to. The simple explanation felt profound, heavy with unspoken tragedy. Eleanor knew she was treading on sacred, sorrowful ground, but she couldn't stop herself. She was a problem solver, a diagnostician of systems. This was the biggest system failure she had ever encountered. "You're hiding," Eleanor stated. It wasn't a question. Isabella met her gaze, and for the first time there was a flash of steel in her eyes, a reflection of the formidable intellect she kept so carefully concealed. Perhaps, or perhaps I'm remembering. There is a difference. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor alone with her perfectly cooked fish and a maelstrom of thoughts. The world was not as simple as she had made it. It was not a neat hierarchy of the powerful and the powerless, the intelligent and the ignorant. She had built a billion-dollar empire on the belief that she could read people assess their value and predict their behavior. And in the space of 30 minutes, a quiet waitress named Isabella had taken that belief and shattered it into 1,000,000 pieces. Eleanor picked up her fork and took a bite of the sea bass. It was without a doubt the best thing she had ever tasted. Eleanor ate her meal in silence, her mind a chaotic landscape of questions. The other diners, sensing the storm had passed, slowly returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere in Il Nido del Corvo remained subtly charged. Isabella moved through the room, attending to her other tables, with a quiet efficiency that now seemed less like humility and more like a carefully worn disguise. When Eleanor had finished, Isabella returned to clear her plate. "Was everything all right?" she asked, the professional mask back in place. It was more than all right, Eleanor admitted. The honesty felt like a concession. It was perfect. "I'll let the chef know. My uncle will be pleased." "Your uncle is the chef, and my cousin Paolo is the nervous young man you frightened earlier." Isabella said, a hint of dry humor in her tone. "My mother makes the pasta by hand every morning, and my father Marco tries to run the front of house. It's a family affair." The simple domesticity of it all was so alien to Eleanor's world of anonymous caterers and corporate retreats. She pictured this family working together, bound by blood and bread. A life. A real, tangible, interconnected life. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to the empty chair opposite her. It was an order, but her tone was different now, less imperious, more inquisitive. Isabella hesitated. "I have other tables." "They can wait 5 minutes," Eleanor countered. "Please." The please hung in the air, a rare and precious coin from Eleanor's depleted currency of civility. Isabella studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod and sat down, her posture elegant even in the rustic wooden chair. She folded her hands on the table, her long, slender fingers laced together. They looked like the hands of a pianist or a surgeon, not a waitress. "Why did you come back?" Eleanor asked again, her voice softer this time. "From Oxford." "To this?" Isabella's gaze fell to her hands. "I told you, I needed to." She took a breath as if steeling herself to dive into cold water. "I lost someone. My husband." The words were spoken quietly, but they landed with devastating force. "A husband, of course. A woman like that, an intellect like that, she would have had a partner, an equal. He was a professor as well." Isabella continued, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Alistair. Dr. Alistair Finch. He taught philosophy of science. He was brilliant, funny, and kind. He saw the world in patterns and ethics. He believed technology should serve humanity, not the other way around." She spoke of him in the past tense, but with a vividness that brought him to life in the space between them. Eleanor could almost picture him, a charming, tweed-clad academic, probably a bit clumsy, with a mind like a diamond. "We had a life there," Isabella said, a tear tracing a silent path down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand an unself-conscious gesture of grief, a small flat filled with too many books, rainy walks along the river Cherwell, debates over dinner that lasted until 2 in the morning. It was a good life. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice hushed. "An accident," Isabella said, her voice thick with a sorrow so raw it was painful to witness. "A car accident, just outside of London. It was very sudden. One moment he was there on his way to a conference, and the next, he was gone." Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She knew loss, the loss of a deal, the loss of market share, the loss of a key employee to a competitor. But this was different. This was an absolute, irrevocable loss, the deletion of a person from the world. After he died, Isabella went on the world, lost its color. The books on my shelves felt like dead weight. The lecture halls felt like tombs. The theories I taught, the deconstruction of narratives. It all felt like a hollow, meaningless game. My own story had been brutally, nonsensically rewritten, and I couldn't find the words to even begin to understand it. So I came home. Back to something real. The weight of the dough in my mother's hands. The smell of the garlic my uncle is chopping. The feel of a clean, smooth plate. Simple, tangible things. It's all I have left. Her confession was so honest, so vulnerable, that it breached all of Eleanor's defenses. For a fleeting moment, she saw past the waitress, past the professor, and saw a woman, shattered by grief, trying to piece her life back together with the simplest of materials. A wave of empathy, an emotion Eleanor usually dismissed as a business liability, washed over her. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt inadequate, flimsy. Isabella looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Eleanor's. He was working on something important before he died. He was worried. He said that the big tech companies were moving too fast, breaking things they couldn't possibly understand, let alone fix. He called them digital gods playing with digital fire. A chill entirely different from the one before snaked its way down Eleanor's spine. Digital gods playing with digital fire. It sounded like something a headline would scream about her own company. He was a tech ethicist then, Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Among other things, Isabella confirmed. He was writing a paper on the moral hazards of rushing autonomous vehicle technology to market. He said the race for profit was overriding the responsibility for human life. He believed a catastrophic failure was not a matter of if, but when. The room suddenly felt cold. The cheerful chatter of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in Eleanor's ears. Autonomous vehicle technology, the race for profit. The words echoed in her mind, a terrible familiar refrain. They were the very words her own head of engineering, a cautious man named David Chen, had used in a memo 6 months before the launch of their flagship autonomous driving software. A memo she had dismissed as alarmist, hand-wringing. A memo she had ordered buried. What was the name of the project he was investigating? Eleanor asked, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Isabella frowned, trying to recall the details through the haze of her grief. It was a strange name, a name from mythology. He said it was fitting for a monster made of disparate, poorly integrated parts. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes clear and unblinking. He was writing about a system called Project Chimera. The name hit Eleanor Vance like a physical blow. Project Chimera. It wasn't a public name. It was the internal code name, the name used in the labs, in the encrypted memos, in the hushed, high-pressure meetings, in the glass-walled conference rooms of Vance Innovations. It was the name of her greatest triumph, the revolutionary autonomous driving software that had sent her company's stock into the stratosphere. Her blood ran cold. The air in her lungs turned to ice. The face of David Chen, her head of engineering, flashed in her memory. His worried expression, his pleas for another 6 months of testing his warnings about edge case sensor fusion anomalies. The race for profit is overriding the responsibility for human life, he had written in that buried memo. The exact phrase Isabella's husband had used. Eleanor's carefully constructed world, already cracked by Isabella's intellect, now began to crumble into dust. She stared at the woman across the table, this grieving widow serving pasta in her family's restaurant, and saw the ghost of a man she had never met, but whose life she had just discovered. She had irrevocably, catastrophically altered. Project Chimera Eleanor repeated her voice, a strangled whisper. She could feel the blood draining from her face. Isabella nodded, oblivious to the bomb she had just detonated. Yes, that was it. Alistair was convinced it was dangerously unstable. He'd found a flaw in the primary sensor logic, something about how it processed data in low-light, high-precipitation conditions. He said it could lead to a complete system failure. He was on his way to a conference in London to present his preliminary findings. He hoped it would force the company behind it to issue a recall before someone got hurt. Low-light, high-precipitation conditions. The official accident report, the one Eleanor's legal team had fought to keep sealed, had been precise. The crash occurred at 9:47 p.m. on a rainy stretch of the M40 motorway. The other driver was found to be at fault, a tired lorry driver who had swerved. But the Vance vehicle's telemetry data, the data David Chen had flagged the data, that was now buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements and sealed settlements, had shown a 500 millisecond sensor blackout, a fatal half-second where the car was driving blind. Just as Alistair Finch had predicted. Dr. Alistair Finch, the name from the settlement, the academic from Oxford. The widower's estate had been paid $8 million in exchange for their silence, a nuisance fee her lawyers had called it, the cost of doing business. But it wasn't a nuisance fee. It was the price of a man's life, the price of Isabella's happiness, and the woman who had signed the check, the woman who had pushed the launch, the woman who had ignored the warnings in her relentless pursuit of market dominance, was sitting right here, enjoying a perfectly cooked meal served by his widow. The irony was so cruel, so cosmically vicious, that Eleanor felt a wave of nausea roll over her. The delicious sea bass turned to ash in her mouth. "Are you all right, Madam Isabella?" asked her brow furrowed with genuine concern. "You've gone terribly pale." Eleanor couldn't speak. She could only stare at Isabella's face, her kind, intelligent, grief-stricken face. This woman had mourned her husband, her brilliant Alistair, blaming a tired lorry driver, a tragic random accident. She had no idea that the true culprit, the architect of her pain, was the impatient American woman who had screamed at her over a slice of lime. The weight of it was crushing. It was a physical pressure on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. All her life, her actions had consequences she could measure on a balance sheet. A stock price went up, a competitor went down, numbers on a screen. But this was real. This was a shattered life, a hollowed-out soul, and the bill had just been delivered to her table. She had to get out of there. She had to run. She couldn't sit here under the gentle, concerned gaze of the woman whose world she had destroyed. She fumbled for her purse, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp the clasp. She pulled out her wallet, her fingers clumsy and useless. I have to go," she stammered, throwing a handful of euro notes onto the table. It was far too much a vulgar display that meant nothing. Money was the weapon she had always used, the solution to every problem. But it couldn't solve this. It had only caused it. "Madam, you've barely finished your wine," Isabella said, confused by the sudden change. "I'm not feeling well," Eleanor choked out, pushing her chair back and stumbling to her feet. The entire restaurant was a blur. The faces, the lights, the smells, it was all overwhelming her senses. She had to escape before the truth spilled out of her, a toxic, unforgivable confession. She turned and fled, pushing past a startled Paolo, past a concerned Marco, out of the warm, fragrant light of the restaurant, and into the cold, dark, Tuscan night. She ran down the cobbled street, her expensive shoes slipping on the damp stones. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran, propelled by a guilt so profound it felt like it was physically consuming her. She ran from the name Alistair Finch. She ran from the words Project Chimera, and she ran from the unbearable kindness in the eyes of the waitress named Isabella. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was a truth she could never outrun. The cold Tuscan night air was not just a temperature, it was a verdict. It flooded Eleanor's lungs, a chilling repudiation of the hermetically sealed, climate-controlled world she inhabited. She stumbled away from the warm light of Il Nido del Corvo, her expensive leather shoes slipping precariously on the damp, uneven cobblestones that had been set in place centuries before. Her empire of silicon and code was even a dream. Her flight was pure instinct, a primal urge to outrun a truth so monstrous it threatened to unmake her. She finally came to a halt, her hands braced against a low stone wall that smelled of moss and damp earth. Below her, the Val d'Elsa unfurled in a tapestry of silver and shadow under the moonlight, the iconic cypress trees standing like solemn mourners at a funeral. Her funeral. Because the Eleanor Vance, who had walked into that restaurant, the titan, the shark, the architect of the future, was dead. She had been murdered by a ghost named Dr. Alistair Finch, and a truth delivered by his grieving widow. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic and strategy, was a battlefield. Images sharp and cruel fired like shrapnel through her consciousness. The smug, triumphant smile on her face at the Chimera launch party, champagne flute in hand. The precise, dismissive wave of her hand as she shut down David Chen's final plea for more testing in the boardroom. "We can't let caution cripple innovation, David. The market won't wait," she had said, her voice dripping with the condescension of a queen addressing a courtier. She saw the $8 million settlement for the Finch estate not as a human tragedy, but as a minor line item, an acceptable cost of business swiped away with the same thoughtless flick of a pen she used to approve catering invoices. Isabella was a professor of narrative. Eleanor finally understood. Her own life was a narrative, a carefully constructed story, she told herself, and the world the story of a self-made woman, a visionary building a better tomorrow. It was a lie. A grand, glittering, billion-dollar lie. The real story was one of reckless ambition, of a hubris so profound it treated human life as collateral damage. She wasn't a builder. She was a demolitions expert, and she had just been handed the bill for the most precious thing she had ever destroyed. A wave of nausea, acrid and violent, rose in her throat. She retched over the ancient wall, the perfect sea base, and expensive wine, a bitter poison in her stomach. Wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, she felt the rough texture of her diamond ring against her skin. It felt alien, a vulgar bauble from a life that no longer belonged to her. In the desolate clarity that followed, she knew the easy path was a betrayal. Flying away, burying this secret, would be the final unforgivable sin. It would prove that she was, and always had been, the monster Isabella now knew her to be. The only path forward, the only one that didn't lead to a completely hollow existence, led back up that hill. Her emergency phone felt heavy and obscene in her trembling hand. She dialed the numbers glowing in the dark. "Janet, it's Eleanor." Janet's voice was tinny, startled. "Eleanor, it's 3 a.m. here. Is everything all right?" "No." Eleanor said, her voice a strange, dead thing. "Nothing is all right. I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are to issue an immediate and global recall of every single vehicle running the Chimera software platform. Ground the entire network. Shut it down." The silence from Palo Alto was so absolute, it was like the line had gone dead. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? That's over 1 million cars. The financial impact. It's not just the stock, the lawsuits, the service contracts, the brand damage. It would be an extinction-level event for the company. We would be bankrupt by Friday. Then we'll be bankrupt by Friday." Eleanor replied, a terrifying calm settling over her. "The board will crucify you. They'll activate the key person liability clause. The shareholder actions will strip you of everything," Janet Eleanor said, her voice low and intense, "for 10 years. We have lived by the numbers. We have worshipped at the altar of market capitalization and quarterly earnings. We told ourselves we were innovators, but we became gamblers, and we placed our bet on a table where human lives were part of the stakes. We lost. I lost. The house always wins." She took a breath. "There was an incident, a fatality the world thinks was an accident. It wasn't. It was our code, our flaw. A man named Dr. Alistair Finch. I want you to unseal his settlement. I want you to hand over every piece of unredacted data David Chen ever compiled on the sensor fusion anomaly. Give it all to the NTSB, the European regulators, anyone who asks. We will not hide. We will not spin. We will not fight. We will confess." "Eleanor, this is madness," Janet whispered, horrified. "No," Janet Eleanor said, looking up at the cold, distant stars. "This is the first sane thing I've done in a very long time." She hung up. The walk back to the restaurant was a pilgrimage. Every step was a word in a silent prayer of penance. The ancient stones beneath her feet seemed to judge her of their permanence, a stark contrast to the fleeting, destructive nature of her ambition. She was no longer walking to assert her power, but to surrender it completely. When she entered, the last of the diners were gone. Marco looked up from his accounts at the bar, his expression shifting from surprise to deep concern. Isabella was nowhere to be seen. "Isabella," Eleanor said, her voice raspy. Marco gestured with his head towards the beaded curtain. Eleanor pushed it aside and found Isabella in the small, cluttered office, sitting at the desk, a single dim lamp illuminating her face. She wasn't crying. She was unnervingly still, like a figure in a classical painting of profound grief. She looked up as Eleanor entered, her eyes, dark, knowing pools of sorrow. "I knew you'd be back," Isabella said. "The villain always returns to the scene of the crime in the final act." The academic observation, so cold and precise, was more cutting than any insult. Eleanor didn't have the strength to stand. She sank into the rickety wooden chair opposite the desk, and there in the cramped office, smelling of ink and history, she gave her full confession. It was a litany of her sins, a detailed account of her corporate hubris. She named the engineers she'd ignored, quoted the warnings she'd dismissed, described the champagne she'd tasted at the launch party. She laid her soul bare, offering every ugly detail as a piece of a pathetic, inadequate apology. Isabella listened without interruption, her hands clasped on the desk. Her face was a mask of stoic control, but Eleanor could see the storm raging beneath the surface, the clenching of a muscle in her jaw, the way her knuckles turned white. She was a professor of narrative, and she was listening to the secret authorial footnotes that explained the destruction of her own life story. When Eleanor finished, her voice choked with shame. The silence that fell was heavy enough to smother all hope. Finally, Isabella spoke her voice, a low, chilling whisper. He was reading Kant that final week, in this very room on his holiday. He was rereading the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals. He truly believed in the categorical imperative that you must act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always, at the same time, as an end. She leaned forward, the lamp casting stark shadows across her face. And that is all he was to you, Miss Vance. A means, a statistical risk to be mitigated by a settlement, an obstacle on the path to a higher stock price. You didn't just cause his death. You violated the very core of his philosophy. You made his life and his death meaningless. The sheer intellectual and emotional force of her judgment struck Eleanor with the power of a physical blow. I know Eleanor wept the words tearing from her throat. I know. I have started the recall. I have ordered the truth to be released. I will lose everything. They will take the company, my fortune, my freedom, perhaps. I will accept it all. Isabella let out a single sharp, mirthless laugh. You will lose things that can be counted. I lost a universe. I lost the sound of his laugh. I lost the conversations we would have had, the children we would never have, the quiet comfort of growing old with the one person who truly understood me. Do not speak to me of your losses. Then tell me what to do, Eleanor begged, her voice broken. Tell me how to make any of this right. I will do anything. Isabella rose from her chair and walked to the small window looking out at the darkness. For a long time she was silent. When she turned back, the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard, desolate clarity. You want to know what to do. You cannot fix this. Forgiveness is a grace I no longer possess. It was buried with him. Absolution is not on the menu here. She walked back to the desk and stood over Eleanor, not as a waitress, but as a judge delivering a sentence. What I can give you is a purpose. Your punishment will not be in a courtroom or a prison. It will be in your soul. You will live. You will go back to your world of power and influence, and you will carry this story with you every single day. When you sit in a boardroom, you will see my husband's face. When you look at a balance sheet, you will remember the cost that can never be quantified. You will remember his name, Dr. Alistair Finch, and you will spend every remaining day of your life becoming the conscience your company and your entire industry so desperately lacks. You will learn the agonizing difference between value and worth. It was not a reprieve. It was a life sentence of meaningful torment. A command to build a legacy, not of wealth, but of atonement. I, Will Eleanor, vowed the promise, a sacred, unbreakable oath. She rose, her body aching with the weight of her new burden. There were no more words. She turned and walked out of the office past a silent watching Marco, and out of the restaurant for the final time. The first pale grey light of dawn was breaking over the Tuscan hills. It was not a hopeful light. It was cold and unforgiving, the light of a new day, in a world that would never be the same. Her empire was falling. Her life was in ruins. But for the first time, she had a reason to build something new from the rubble. Not for profit, not for glory, but for the memory of a man she had never met, and for the quiet waitress who had taught her the true meaning of loss. The story of Eleanor Vance and Isabella Rossi isn't just about a clash of two worlds. It's a powerful, raw reminder that behind every corporate decision, every product launch and every headline, there are human lives. It shows us how easy it is to become insulated by success, to forget the real-world consequences of our ambition. Eleanor's journey from arrogance to absolute brokenness, and Isabella's quiet, devastating strength forces us to ask ourselves, what are the hidden costs of the systems we participate in every day? And what does true accountability look like? It's rarely about money or power. It's about facing the truth, no matter how ugly, and carrying the weight of it with integrity. What did you take away from this story? Have you ever witnessed a moment where a powerful person was humbled by an unexpected truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective makes our community richer. And if this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates deep storytelling, and be sure to subscribe for more real-life dramas that make you think and feel. Thank you for listening.